Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. I got a viewer question wanting to know specifically when I would throw a Choppo, a plopper style bait, versus a toad style bait. Now, I think a lot of you would look at this and say these are completely different baits, but there are a lot of very good similarities between the two. They're two great topwater baits for covering a bunch of water. So I want to break down some of my personal experiences to where I like to use both of these and when I consider one over the other because they're not normally interchangeable baits for me. Before I do get into that, I want to remind you guys, though, that I do a bunch of lake breakdowns where I provide 40 waypoints based on the season for specific techniques and specific patterns on the lakes in your area. So check those out. I'll put the link in the video description for the lake breakdowns. Also, if you want to support the channel and you're looking to purchase tackle, please use my Tackle Warehouse affiliate link. Every cent that comes from that comes right back into making content for you guys out there. All right, so the question I got, I was doing a topwater video, and the question was pertaining. In the video, I talked about the Choppo, and people wanted to know, well, the Choppo is a great bait, but when would you throw a toad style bait like this Berkeley Buzz and Speed Toad? And the reality is, the biggest single difference, and this is probably what all of you are thinking, but this isn't the only one, has to do with whether or not I'm fishing around vegetation. A Berkeley Choppo does not come through vegetation well. So if you've got a bunch of grass, submerging grass that's starting to hit the surface, or a bunch of floating grass, maybe you've got a bunch of eel grass floating around on the lake like you get at Lake Gunnersville. Maybe you've just got a bunch of filament that's starting to float around. Maybe you've got a big LJ bloom. When that happens, the Choppo or a plopper style bait is generally not going to be your best selection, just from the standpoint of all of that grass and filament starts getting caught up in all of the moving parts, and therefore it really prevents the Choppo from working properly. Whereas if you've got a Texas rigged buzz and speed toad or whatever your toad of choice is, this bait will come through basically anything and throw a good, commotion with the tails on the surface. And from that standpoint, it's a really good bait to be using around grass. But that's not solely it. I want to tell you a little bit of a story. I was throwing a Choppo at Lake Chickamauga. I was going down the bank and I was not getting that many bites. I'd get one here, get one there, but it was during a shad spawn. And what I found was a lot of the fish were blowing up on the shad, but I couldn't get them to hit a Choppo. Well, I had at the same time, because I was fishing Lake Chickamauga, which has a bunch of grass in it, I also had a buzz and speed toad rigged up. It was a straight pearl colored one at the time. And I picked that up and started throwing that along the bank and bringing it out through those areas where the shad were spawning. And I was getting way more bites on this guy. And a lot of that has to do with the commotion that these two baits make. A plopper style bait is much more of that buzz bait commotion. It's got much more of that, plopper, plop, plop, plop. It makes more commotion. Doesn't really sound like shad that are flickering around the surface. You put a toad style bait on, bring this across the surface, and you get that much finer spray. You don't get a plop sound, but you get more of that spraying commotion. And what that does is it sounds a lot more like a shad. So from that standpoint, I believe that's why I was getting a lot more bites during the shad spawn on a toad style bait than I would with the Choppo. Now, I have mimicked this same thing on a lot of other lakes during the shad spawn. So for me, if I'm fishing during the shad spawn, I actually prefer to go with a toad style bait for a couple of reasons. One, I think it mimics the shad better, but two, depending on where those fish are or the shad are spawning, the toad style bait allows you to get your bait into tighter areas and along cover better without getting snagged than you will with a Choppo. So that's another plus to it. If you've got a dock slip that the shad are spawning under, and you need to skip this under there, you can do it a lot easier without getting hung up than your Choppo style bait. Along those same lines, based on the sound that this guy makes, I prefer to fish a toad style bait around fry balls. So if I know that I've got bass that have spawned, they're in the post spawn phase where you've got a lot of bass that are guarding fry ball. Fry balls, when they get chased, a lot of times they come to the surface and create a little spraying. It almost looks like a mist on the water or a real light rain. And again, that's what you get out of your toad. So, in my opinion, if you've got bass that are guarding fry, a lot of times your toad style bait will be a better bait to use under those circumstances. Plus, you can drop this bait down into holes or areas where you think you've got fish that might be protecting fry. Definitely gives an advantage to this bait. Now, from a Choppo standpoint, I think I can cover more water with the Choppo. I think I can cover more water efficiently under conditions where maybe I've got a little bit of chop on the water. Where, if I've got a little chop on the water, a toad style bait is generally not going to be a great bait because it doesn't throw much commotion. Now, a plopper style bait like the Choppo will come through a little bit rougher water. It will create a lot of commotion and have enough noise, vibration, and sound to draw the fish to it. So for me, if I'm fishing under any conditions where I've got a little chop on the water, the Choppo is a better bait to go with. I also love this bait for fishing around hard bottom areas. If I've got, say I'm going around a bunch of points, secondary points, and I'm trying to cover water, I've got a lot of rock transitions, isolated boulders. From that standpoint, the Choppo seems to draw much better strikes under rocky conditions. Again, maybe that just goes back to the type of bait, and I'm fishing this generally around grass, which is going to be a softer bottom for the most part. But there's something about a Choppo style bait when you're fishing those highland impoundment lakes that really generates a lot of really good strikes. The other thing I love to do with a Choppo is to fish it around isolated cover. So maybe I've got dock posts, maybe I've got a stump, maybe I've got a lay down tree. From that standpoint, I feel like I can do a lot more with this from a straight retrieve where I can bring it past the object to try to draw the fish out. But at the same time, I can cast my bait up there and almost work it as if I would a popper, where I get it to sit on the surface, pop it a little bit, get it to, throw a little commotion and sit. And that generates a lot of strikes if you're fishing around those isolated targets. So if I've got a dock post, I throw it up there and it's basically almost being worked like a popper. I'm twitching it around until I get it out of the strike zone. I'll reel it in, make another cast to the next target. And again, toad style bait is great doing that if you've got holes in grass. Any form of emergent grass or submergent grass that reach the surface or lily pads, those are all really good areas where you can work this bait over the thick stuff, get it into a hole and drop it. Now I could throw a Choppo style bait and work it just in that hole as well. The problem is if I draw a strike, I've got a bunch of treble hooks hanging out of the fish's mouth, which tend to get hooked up on a lot of that other vegetation, and therefore I lose fish doing that. And a toadstool bait will allow me to not only work that hole, but it'll allow me to work any of the pads or the other grass that is matted up between myself and that hole. And if I do generate a strike, I've got a single bigger hook in here, which tends to lead to better landing percentage. So those are kind of the times when I like to mix them up. I generally do not find that these baits are very interchangeable. I feel like when I've got the right circumstances for a Choppo style bait, I'd much rather throw this. And when I've got the right circumstances for a toadstool bait generally will outperform. So those are my reasonings for these two baits. I hope that answers the viewer question. Guys, let me know if you've got other similar questions like this that you want me to do a video on, one bait versus another. I really enjoy doing these because I think they're very good questions. And a lot of times my perspective on it might be different than your perspective or another viewer. And therefore, it leads to good discussion and it leads to good thinking outside of the box. So if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and stay tuned. We'll have a new tip video coming out tomorrow.